Hello, I am Eddie O'Sullivan, and this is This Week in the Second World War. In This Week in the Second World War, brought to you by the International Second World War History Network, in 1939, on the 17th of November, Nazi forces storm universities in Czechoslovakia, attacking and arresting thousands of students. 9 Czechs are executed without trial that day for leading demonstrations on Czech Independence Day the previous month. On the 19th of November, the Warsaw Ghetto and Jewish districts are placed under strict control. On the 20th of November, Jewish assets in banks and the general government are blocked. On the 21st of November, Britain imposes a blockade on German exports in reprisal for incidents at sea. On the 22nd of November, the Polish government in exile moves from Paris to Angers. On the 23rd of November, Jews over 10 in the general government are ordered to wear armbands with the Star of David, and the official Secrets Act 1939 receives royal assent in the United Kingdom. In 1940, on the 17th of November, Britain attempts to deliver 14 aircraft from an aircraft carrier to Malta, but only 5 planes make it due to bad weather and the presence of the Italian fleet. Sholto Douglas replaces Hugh Dowding as Commander-in-Chief of RAF Fighter Command. On the 18th of November, Count Galiziano Ciano meets Hitler in the Berghof. Hitler was pessimistic about Italy's war on Greece, but enthusiastic about negotiating an alliance with Yugoslavia. Gauleiter Josef Burkel expels 100,000 Lorrainers who want to keep their French citizenship. On the 19th of November, 900 are killed in a German bombing raid on Birmingham. On the 20th of November, Hungary joins the Tripartite Pact. On the 21st of November, Hitler meets Romanian head of government Ion Antonescu in Berlin and indicates he plans to attack the Soviet Union. Italian forces are pushed back into Albania. On the 23rd of November, Romania joins the Tripartite Pact. The first sustained air raid on Southampton takes place, and Belgium declares war on Italy. Belgian Congolese forces would now coordinate with the British to fight the Italians in Africa. In 1941, on the 18th of November, the British 8th Army begins Operation Crusader to lift the Siege of Tobruk. On the 19th of November, a battle between Australian and German ships takes place off the coast of Western Australia. The retirement of Sir John Dill as British Chief of Staff is announced. Sir Alan Brooke is designated to succeed him. On the 20th of November, Palestinian leader Amin al-Husseini meets Joachim von Ribbentrop in Berlin. Talks open in Washington between Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Japanese Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura, and Special Japanese Envoy Saburo Kurusu. The Japanese demand that the Americans withdraw from China, lift all sanctions, and halt the naval build-up in the Pacific. On the 21st of November, the Battle of Rostov begins on the Eastern Front, and General Alan Cunningham orders the British 70th Division to break out of Tobruk, which it manages to do after a day's fighting. In 1942, on the 18th of November, the British 8th Army reaches Sardinia in Libya. Philippe Pétain grants Vichy Prime Minister Pierre Laval the authority to rule by decree, and President Roosevelt orders registration for selective service of all youths who had turned 18 since the 1st of July. This made about 500,000 more Americans eligible for service. On the 19th of November, the Soviets launch Operation Uranus to surround Stalingrad. A British airborne force lands in Norway to sabotage a chemical plant in Telemark, which the Germans could use for their atomic weapons program. On the 20th of November, the siege of Malta ends after 2 years, 5 months and 9 days. The British 8th Army captures Benghazi. On the 21st of November, Hitler forbids the German 6th Army from retreating from Stalingrad. On the 22nd of November, the new German Army Group Dawn, is created with Erich von Manstein in command. Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist was made Commander-in-Chief of Army Group A. On the 23rd of November, Operation Uranus ends with the 6th Army completely encircled, and the governor of French West Africa accepts the authority of François Dalin. This brings Dakar under Allied control. In 1943, on the 17th of November, the Battle of Saddleberg begins at the Huon Peninsula campaign in New Guinea. On the 18th of November, the RAF launches the largest bombing campaign against Berlin up to that time. The Ebensee concentration camp opens. Its inmates work on a missile facility. At its peak, the camp had 18,000 slave workers engaged in mining operations. 11,000 of its inmates were to die from starvation and disease. On the 20th of November, US Marines make amphibious landings on Tarawa and Makin to open the assault on the Gilbert Islands. The British evacuate Samos Island. British fascist leader Oswald Mosley and his wife Diana are released from prison after 3 years. On the 21st of November, broadcaster Drew Pearson breaks the story that General Eisenhower had reprimanded George Patton for hitting a soldier under his command in Sicily in August. On the 22nd of November, at the Cairo conference codenamed Sextants, Roosevelt, Winston Churchill and Chiang Kai-shek meet to discuss ways to defeat Japan in the Pacific War. Lebanon becomes independent when French High Commissioner Helou orders the release of the President, Prime Minister and Cabinet members who had been jailed 10 days earlier. This brought an end to the French mandate, and the date is celebrated as Lebanon's Independence Day. The Allied Dodecanese campaign ends in failure, and on the 23rd of November, the battles of Tarawa and Makin end, and Hitler attends a demonstration of the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet. In 1944, on the 17th of November, Britain's Second Army captures Wessem in the Netherlands. On the 18th of November, American forces enter Metz in eastern France. On the 19th of November, the British Second Army captures the German city of Geilenkirchen. On the 20th of November, Hitler leaves the Wolf's Lair for the final time. The Kosovo operation ends in partisan victory, and the blackout ends in London's Piccadilly, the Strand and Fleet Street. On the 21st of November, the French First Army capture Belfort near the Swiss border in southeast France. On the 22nd of November, Operation Clipper in Germany ends in Allied victory. Canadian Prime Minister William Mackenzie King tells Parliament that it had not become necessary to require drafted troops to serve overseas, and that to do so would, quote, occasion the most serious controversy that could arise in Canada. On the 23rd of November, French forces liberate Strasbourg on the west bank of the Rhine River. In 1945, on the 17th of November, Joseph Kramer, Irma Grazer and 9 other Belsen camp guards are sentenced to death as war criminals. On the 19th of November, General MacArthur orders the arrest of 11 Japanese wartime leaders, including ex-Foreign Minister Yusuke Matsuoka. On the 20th of November, the Nuremberg trials begin. On the 22nd of November, British Conservative Deputy Leader Anthony Eden tells the House of Commons that the first duty of the United Nations would be to take the sting out of nationalism, and he opposes the plan for Security Council members to have the power of veto. On the 23rd of November, police fire on anti-British rioters in Calcutta, killing 37, and US Agriculture Secretary Clinton Anderson announces the end of most food rationing in America. Well, there you are. We've gone through 1939 to 1945, all in the period 17th to 23rd of November, and another set of really important pivotal moments in the war, and we're going to go through them systematically. So I'd like to add to the stage, bring into view Joe Quinn. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Eddie. How are you doing this evening?
Yes, fine. Thank you. So let's go through some of those dates. So I want to start with Czechoslovakia, very briefly. This was what Czechoslovakia looked like in 1939, after the Germans had completed the conquest of the country in 1939, March 39. And so what was Czechoslovakia had been reduced to nothing much more than a rump. So Bohemia and Moravia was under a German protectorate, so it hadn't been absorbed into the Third Reich, and it was eventually going to be taken over by Heydrich, who was assassinated in Prague. Slovakia had become a fascist-aligned, Axis-aligned state, and as you can see, the countries around them have taken big slabs of what was Czechoslovakia. I mean, it was made independent in October 1918. So the Hungarians took a big slab of Slovakia, and the Poles took a bit. And of course, the Third Reich took what they claimed is the Sudetenland, and they annexed it to Germany. So, and what happened in Prague? Prague, I mean, of course, at this point, at the start of the war, was one of the most advanced industrial economies in Western Europe. Certainly, Bohemia and Moravia had a very extensive heavy industry and arms industry, and had a very sophisticated population, urban population, and the students demonstrated. They made some demonstrations against Nazi rule, of course, which had begun in March, and the Nazis cracked down. And the 17th of November, which is during the war this week, that's the 17th, and that's when the Nazis went into the universities where the demonstrations were, arrested a lot of people, shot 9. And this set the scene for the intensifying repression of the Czech people. And it's remembered, actually, the 17th of November for post-war period was celebrated as International Student Day. But since the Velvet Revolution 1989, it's now seen as the anniversary of the Velvet Revolution, when the communist system was brought down. So anyway, Joe, any comments on Czechoslovakia?
Yeah, well, I think it's very interesting that when Czechoslovakia was basically invaded by German forces in March 1939, when they just marched in, having already annexed the Sudetenland, and obviously you had the annexation of Austria as well happening the previous year as well. So you have this exponential growth of German territory. This primarily had been, based on the whole idea of annexing territory that was rightfully German. There were actually German ethnic and culturally German people living upon these particular lands. And if you ever go to Czechoslovakia, to these particular areas, they're lived in. These areas are lived in by Czechs. But if you go there, like the buildings, the towns, just the way the buildings are constructed, it is culturally German. And
absolutely, I visited. I mean, I went first to Czechoslovakia in 1973.
Yeah.
But I went there for work about 20 years ago, and I went to Karlovy.
Yes.
And Pilsen, of course, for the beer.
Yes.
Fantastic. And Karlovy, and you went there, and you just felt and looked Germanic.
German.
You were in Bavaria, except no Germans, of course.
No Germans.
Thrown out in 1945, very brutally as well.
Yes, very brutally. And if you go to the graveyards, there's a graveyard hanging on the side of a sort of like, it's almost like a cliff, overlooking Karlovy Vary, because Karlovy Vary is sunk into sort of like a kind of a valley, sort of with a kind of a river or a stream going through it, and there's hills on either side. If you're walking along one of those hills, sort of where because the town kind of goes up the side of this kind of, it's like a ravine more than anything. There's a graveyard perched on the side of this ravine, and the names on those graves are all German, or rather Austrian reading names. I found it very sad and very strange almost.
Yeah.
We were standing in a place that once belonged to one particular population, and because of everything that had happened at the end of the Second World War, people must remember that ethnic cleansing didn't just apply to Germans, ethnically cleansing Czechs and Poles and all the horrific stuff that was done under Hitler's regime. There was reverse ethnic cleansing towards the end of the war in Poland and places like Czechoslovakia, or areas where German populations used to live. But what's significant about the annexation of what's left of Czechia and what's left of Czechoslovakia is this is the first time where the Germans are actually moving into a wholesale territory that is not ethnically or culturally German. And they're moving in, and that's why Czechia, what's left of it, of what we now call the Czech Republic, becomes a protectorate. So that's the Bohemian protectorate, and they don't even give it its proper name, the name that the Czechs would give it. They call it Bohemian Moravia, which is essentially reverting back to an old imperial term from the time of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
I think the Nazis didn't recognize the Czechs as a people.
Yes, no. And Hitler, if people think about Hitler having some sort of fixation with Poland, this is a very important point to make, a very important point. People don't realize how close Germany was to going to war in 1938 as opposed to 1939. 39 was something that the Germans didn't really take as seriously. I mean, they wanted the Polish corridor. They wanted, sort of to unify the territories within Poland that they felt were ethnically German, and sort of the population bases. And this was another, as far as Hitler was concerned, is another pretext for annexation, invasion, and he was kind of calling the bluff of the Western Allies. But he didn't have a red-hot obsession with Poland necessarily. It wasn't his diehard mission to get hold of Polish territory or to destroy the Polish state. He didn't have this hatred of the Polish state in the same way that we think we did. It was the Czechoslovakian state that Hitler absolutely despised. He had this absolutely obsessive hatred with that particular construct, because that state had been formed. Bear in mind that Hitler had been born an Austrian citizen, subject. He was not a German. He was not born a German. He was born under the Austro-Hungarian Empire and ended up fighting in the Bavarian army during the First World War. He was basically an immigrant in Germany at the time. So he had this absolute razor sharp hatred for the construct of the Czechoslovakian state. And this hatred was manifested by many leaders, including Heydrich himself, when he was the so-called Reichsprotector of Bohemian Moravia. The day that Nazi Germany declared war on the United States, following their declaration of war on Japan after Pearl Harbor, Heydrich was informed. He was in his office in Prague, conducting his business, whatever, his brutal business, because he was known as the Butcher of Prague before he was assassinated. And he was informed by his aide that Germany had declared war on the United States. And he paused for a moment, and then he turned to his aide and he said, "Go down to the train station, the central train station in Prague, and tear down the statue of Woodrow Wilson. I never want to see that piece of shit ever again." That was his those were his exact words, forgive my language. So there's a hatred for, this is the Treaty of Versailles, these are the Treaty of Sèvres, and all these treaties that came out of the Paris peace agreements in 1919. This is the Nazi revisionism that is happening. They're undoing all the borders and all the new sort of independent states that have been created in Europe post First World War. But one particular state that they absolutely had their sights on, their iron sights on, was the Czechoslovakian state. And when Czechoslovakia was overrun by German forces in March 1939, with no resistance coming from Czech forces, because they knew that if they tried to put up a fight, they knew that it would be absolutely pointless, and they weren't going to get support from any side, and the international community basically failed to come to their aid. Hitler himself, a day or two later, went to Prague. It would be the only time that he would ever go to this city. And it was, for him, going to Prague was the most. It wasn't Paris, it wasn't Warsaw, it was Prague. This was one of his big triumphal moments. Something that he remembered for the rest of his life, is that this was the accomplishment of a life's ambition. And he went to the castle, I can't remember the name of the castle in Prague, and he dined in the banqueting hall. And he dined, this is a man who was a teetotaling, non-smoking vegetarian. And what did he have for dinner? He had a bratwurst sausage and a pint or a pitcher of Pilsner Urquell.
There you go. Yeah, Pilsner.
There you go. What a hypocrite! It's almost as bad as Monty drinking champagne on Lüneburg Heath after the Germans surrendered.
That was the worst thing.
Hypocrites.
If that was the worst thing that Hitler did in the war. I mean, in 1973, when I went there, I stayed with the Czech family, and the grandmother, who was in her 70s at the time, she remembered very clearly the Emperor Joseph, because when she was born, she was an Austrian citizen. Her husband was an anti-Nazi. He had been shipped off to Theresienstadt and died there or in Auschwitz. And then her family, they were a bourgeois family, so they had all their property nationalized by the communists, so they had factories. Mind you, they had a very nice house, still packed full of art, but they were kind of losers in all directions. And I visited them afterwards, and it's an interesting story. And Bohemia is beautiful. What a beautiful place. And the beer is stunning. So there we go. Now let's talk about these two guys. Oh, look, the name is corrupted. This is rather irritating. But on the left is Hugh Dowding, and on the right is Sholto Douglas. And in this week in 1940, the man on the left was replaced by the man on the right. Now, this seemed, the view is that Dowding was kicked out. Churchill didn't like him, was kicked out, and they brought in Douglas. And Douglas was a great advocate of what's called the big wing concept, Joe. And it's a picture. Formation of 4 squadrons, the big wing. And of course, Douglas Bader, the man with no legs, he was a big advocate of the big wing. So, got any words to say about this change?
Yes, Sholto Douglas is actually one of the, shall we say, for a man who was in a position of command authority within the Royal Air Force in a very key command, that being Fighter Command, for a lengthy period of time. He's somewhat of a footnote when it comes to the Second World War and the commanders that we remember. We all remember, the great Air Force command. We remember Trafford Leigh-Mallory, regardless of whether he was that effective or not. Of course, we remember Hugh Dowding because he was the creator, or he oversaw the creation of the world's first integrated air defense system, which we now call the Dowding system, which is effectively used by every country on Earth, every country that has an organized, disciplined air force as well as detection systems. The Republic of Ireland will eventually adopt a Dowding system when it acquires fighter jets in the next decade. And, this is basically, the Dowding system is effectively its detection of the enemy using radar, or basically what was then known as RDF, radio direction finding, or other acoustic sound systems, which basically picked up bomber engines. Also observer corps volunteers, so basically visual observation as well as radio detection finding, and then basically the communication, the organized systematic communication of that information to sector stations to control the Bentley Priory, and then all the filter down to sector stations, and then essentially command decisions based on this information, because this information had to be deciphered and effectively organized in a particular way that it could be used. And then decisions are made to basically scramble intercepting squadrons that basically get airborne and attack incoming enemy formations. That we have Dowding to thank for that. That was the reason.
Well, do you think he got badly treated He was
absolutely. Well, Dowding was kind of. There's two things to bear in mind about this. Dowding was really kind of. He'd been in charge really since 1930. He'd been at a very senior level within the Royal Air Force since 1930. He'd done his job. He'd been there for well over a decade, and there was a kind of a sense that he had done his job as a sort of an interwar Air Force commander, getting the country ready for war, but that in terms of strategic and tactical decisions, that he had gotten to a point where basically he was no longer really of that much use there was a feeling that they needed more innovative, aggressive thinkers. That Trafford Leigh-Mallory in particular was an example of somebody like Churchill. Churchill really didn't particularly warm to Dowding. He thought he was a kind of an odd individual, whereas Leigh-Mallory was kind of more of a fiery, kind of more proactive person who was willing to try new things in order to get more effective results tactically and strategically. And that was one of the reasons why Leigh-Mallory's career as an Air Force officer flourished. But placing Sholto Douglas in charge of RAF Fighter Command. And by the way, it was Leigh-Mallory initially who was placed into that particular role, but Sholto Douglas ultimately ended up taking over Fighter Command. It was under Sholto Douglas, and this is where this commander falls down in my view. It's under Sholto Douglas that the decisions are made not to deploy frontline fighter squadrons to other theaters such as Malta, for example. Malta was critically short of frontline fighter defenses, air interceptors that could basically take on the bomber streams that were attacking it almost every single day throughout the 2.5 years that it was under siege, as well as attacking the convoys that were being sent in to supply it. They desperately needed fighters, and they needed the state-of-the-art fighters. They needed fighters because there was such a short distance between Malta and the Italian mainland. They needed Spitfires, and they were stuck with Hurricanes for well over a year and a half. And their fighter defenses kept on getting wiped out over and over again through absolutely grinding attrition. And a Fighter Command maintained this policy that we can't spare that many fighters. But by midway through 1941, Fighter Command were more than well stocked up with the state of the art of frontline fighter defenses. They were phasing out the Hurricane. And they were moving from the Spitfire Mark II to the Mark V and the Mark V-B Spitfires, and they were constantly improving and refining the Spitfire, as well as adopting, creating other variants of fighters. We're talking about a force that by the end of 1941 was like in pole position to take on any enemy. And the whole concentration of their strategy, and Sholto Douglas's strategy throughout 41, was to take the Luftwaffe on over the Channel and over northern France and try and win back air superiority, not supremacy, but superiority over the Channel and over northern France, and basically bite back at the Luftwaffe. And this strategy quite accelerated considerably when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, with a huge amount of the Luftwaffe's fighting strength basically been deployed to that theater, as well as the Mediterranean. And the RAF were trying to take advantage of that. But they had the bulk of the RAF's frontline, fighter potential basically concentrated on attacking the Channel ports along the Dutch, Belgian, and northern French coasts. And it just went on, and it was a grinding campaign of basically just attacking these ports through circus and ramrod operations. And the RAF lost a huge amount of talented pilots through this campaign, which went on and on and on. And I would argue, I make one argument, that Sholto Douglas's ramrod and circus campaigns, which were ultimately devised by Mallory, Trafford Leigh-Mallory, was really the author of this strategy of trying to win back air superiority over the Channel using large-scale massed fighter attacks at low level, as well as supporting bombing runs, medium bombers attacking port facilities and army bases and air bases in northern France. The fact of the matter is, it was kind of a very wasteful campaign, and they didn't need to maintain as much resources for home defense in order to maintain these campaigns. They could have deployed those fighters overseas. They could have deployed those squadrons to Malta, to North Africa, to bulk up the Desert Air Force, and also to provide a more adequate defense of Malta, which was in desperate need at that particular time. And Douglas, the criticism I have of Douglas is that there were no measurable gains, there were no measurable victories that he managed to achieve in his time as the air chief, the air marshal commanding Fighter Command. He didn't really achieve anything measurable. The only thing that, it was under his command that the top scoring fighter ace of Fighter Command in 1942, Wing Commander Brendan Finucane, lost his life attacking a German army facility near La Taquette in northern France in July 1942. And Bader also went, sort of under his command as well, and was captured and made a POW. So I think if he's going to be remembered for anything, he's going to be remembered for the fact that he was the Fighter Command commander who lost some of the greatest talent of Fighter Command that we saw during the Battle of Britain and the years following.
Okay, very interesting. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but on the 20th of November 1940, Hungary joined the pact, the tripartite pact. So it became a full partner with Italy and the Third Reich. And this is one of the reasons why this had happened, because one of the great victims of territorial losses between 1939 and 1940 was, of course, Romania. So in 1940, you can see in 1940, they lost what is Transylvania to the Hungarians. The Hungarians have always said Transylvania is mainly a Magyar speaking. They lost Bessarabia and Moldova to the Soviets. And they also lost the Green Territory, not what it's called, to the Bulgarians. So poor old Romania was being dismembered. So on the 20th, the Hungarian side, the tripartite attack, and then on the 21st, Antonescu, he was the head of government of Romania, showed up in Berlin, making a very clear commitment that he was on Hitler's side. And of course, this was to lead to the disastrous decision for the Romanian army to join the Operation Barbarossa not much more than 6 months later, which was a horrific experience for Romania. And then, of course, Romania, of course, actually survived the Second World War reasonably intact. Hungary lost Transylvania. But so I'm not going to go into too much, Joe, because it's a complex story, unless you've got something, any insight on Romania you want to share.
Not a massive amount, no. The Romanians were involved in ethnic cleansing when they went into Ukraine, and is one of the things I would have to say is, like, particularly the annexation of Bessarabia, the territories of Bessarabia that fell within the Soviet Union. It wasn't their finest hour. Antonescu also was a fairly, by all accounts, a fairly brutal dictator. He was easily up there with Ceausescu in terms of, as a tyrannical kind of fascist puppet dictator. And this man was a general. In some ways, he was comparable to Franco. He was a generalissimo of a kind, basically, that had risen to power in Romanian politics, or seized power. So we're talking about a military dictatorship, and it's fair to say that the Romanians did suffer quite a bloody nose through their involvement in Barbarossa and what came after. And the Romanians also played a very key role. They were at Stalingrad, and also they were on Crimea as well. And sort of around Odessa and places like that, you had a lot of Romanian personnel deployed to the Black Sea coast, and you had Romanian vessels Romanian aircraft also fighting in the Soviet Union. So they do play a quite considerable part. It's not, perhaps not a very effective part, but they are there, and they do put up something of a fighter that, certainly boots on the ground. Other than that, I have to say that Romania's war effort was like the war effort of other sort of Axis stooges that basically fought as part of this kind of alliance or coalition that the Nazis put together in order to dominate the Soviet Union. They were to come a cropper in the end. That's all really that I have to say on that.
Yeah, right. Let's move on to 1941 in the November this week. Oh, the 1941 is corrupted. So we've got two guys who. So Dill on the left, he goes to head the British group in America, liaising with the Americans. I forget what it's called, Joint Chiefs of Staff, I think. And then Alan Brooke on the right, he becomes Chief of the Imperial General Staff. So he becomes the most senior military commander in London, advising Churchill. Now, the thing we like about these two guys, of course, there we go, is that Dill was born in Northern Ireland. He's Irish, and he was originally in an Irish regiment. He was in the Leinsters. He was commissioned to the Leinsters. So he was Irish. And Brooke wasn't born in Ireland, but his family certainly is from Northern Ireland. And his father was Viscount Brookborough, or Lord Brookborough. And at this point, in 1941, 2 years later, Alan Brooke's brother becomes Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. And Basil Brooke is Prime Minister of Northern Ireland for 20 years. So these two characters, but both outstanding, weren't they? I mean, they really played a very positive role in the British Second World War effort. Have I got that wrong, Joe?
No, not at all. Brooke was an absolutely incredible CIGS. Stands for Chief of the Imperial General Staff. In other words, head of the army, as well as also basically effective. I think CIGS also basically is senior within all the services. You have all three services basically represented, sort of as equals. The Navy, the Air Force, the Army. But whoever is the senior army commander tends to basically occupy a certain level of seniority within basically the political military establishment in the UK. They generally, this may not be the way the order of things should be, because the Navy is an older service, but the bottom line is whoever has occupied that particular position has always basically been afforded essentially the honor of basically being the overall commander or senior commander of all British forces.
And he wasn't afraid to tell Churchill he was getting it wrong, was he?
Yes, this is his key contribution. Brooke, unlike Dill, the thing about it is Dill and Churchill, they had a reasonably good working relationship, but they didn't necessarily get on. There were disagreements. Dill was a little bit dour, sort of, but he had a very optimistic approach to basically to warfare, particularly coalition warfare. And this is where it turned out that Dill's greatest strengths were. I mean, I'll start with Brooke first. So Brooke got the measure of Churchill and played him like a fiddle, and was able to calm him down when he lost his temper, won him around to a more reasonable decision. When they had the war cabinet meetings, when you had basically the military and naval chiefs basically discussing whether it be Cunningham, Brooke, and Charles Portal representing the Air Force, and they were going through various different discussions about grand strategy level conferences, basically about how to coordinate the tactical air campaigns better in order to support ground forces, i.e. the desert Air Force supporting ground forces in North Africa, or the war in the Mediterranean, and eventually the invasion of Europe through the south, through Italy, and then eventually Operation Overlord and the invasion of Northwest Europe. They were constantly getting in, and also the Battle of the Atlantic. All of these were, key campaigns of massive significance to the outcome of the war, and it was really Churchill and his war cabinet colleagues and his military and naval chiefs that were having these key discussions, and the outcome of these decisions arguably would change the course of the war and change the course of history. These were the most important decisions that were made, arguably, of the entire war by any government, by any establishment anywhere in the world. And they had that key power. So it was very important that they got it right. And Brooke was very good. He was very effective.
And
persuading Churchill to go along with what his military advisors were telling him to do, the decisions that they were advising him to authorize.
And Dill was effective in Washington, wasn't he?
Yes. Well, the thing before Dill, so Dill is he either steps down or is dismissed. I can't remember. He's either replaced with Brooke, sort of around 41, sort of late. I think it's late 40, early 41 that Brooke steps into the role, and he really holds that role for the remainder of the war. And Brooke was kind of an odd choice. He was, he didn't have a reputation as being a particularly well-known or well-regarded field commander. And I think effectively he was like an army bureaucrat, really. But he was very, very politically minded. And like Brooke and Alexander in particular were these figures who kind of they were very good at sort of making things work behind the scenes, whereas Dill did have experience as a sort of a field commander, and he'd been an infantry officer during the First World War, as you said, in the Leinster Regiment. But the thing was that Dill had a sort of he had incredible foresight when it came to coordinating the army's efforts alongside other forces and other branches of the armed forces. In particular, Dill was the first army commander of the war, particularly around the time of Dunkirk, to basically to inform, army ground commanders and, sort of army administrators right across the United Kingdom and elsewhere, that under no circumstances was it to be said within the ranks of the army that the Air Force had not been present during the Dunkirk evacuation. He said our Air Force colleagues were basically deployed considerable resources to providing air cover in order to get our troops off those beaches. And these rumors are percolating right throughout the army. You've troops that came home from France who basically said the RAF were never there. The RAF this, that. And he made sure that this would not happen, that this rumor was killed at source. But the myth persisted. There was a second thing that Dill managed to accomplish, Eddie, which I think is very important. And I need to make this point because I spoke quite a lot about Brooke. Dill was basically instrumental in shoring up Churchill, in convincing his cabinet colleagues that they could fight on during those key days in May 1940, where they contemplated suing for peace, making peace with Hitler through using Signor Bastiani, the Italian ambassador in London, as a conduit to arrange a peace deal with Hitler and end the war between the United Kingdom and Germany, because they felt that France was going to fall and that they wouldn't win the war. And Dill basically was the person on behalf of the armed forces. He said, having conversed with his colleagues, he wrote a memorandum where he basically shored up Churchill and said, "We believe we can fight on. We believe we can hold out." And so Dill was the person who gave Churchill that vote of confidence that the armed forces stood behind him, ready to fight to the very end, and that there was this belief that they could hold out. Lastly, George Marshall, when Dill served in Washington.
He died in 1944 in Washington.
Yes, this is the thing. He served so after serving as chief of the Imperial General Staff, Dill was sent as an envoy, military envoy to Washington, where he served with basically a unified kind of basically U.S. Army, British Army, Canadian Army, a kind of there's a particular name for it, and there's actually a Dutch academic who I've had a lot of contact with, who studied this in detail, and we need to discuss this a bit more. This was an institution that was set up in Washington, where basically British Army, it was set up even before the United States entered the war. And this is where the US Army and the British Army got together for joint, it was Anglo-American planning, basically joint offense planning. And they planned out Operation Overlord in terms of basically joint coalition warfare, and North Africa Operation Torch, and all these various different campaigns where the UK's armed forces and the US armed forces basically acted in concert together. And they basically, all the planning was done in Washington, and Dill was the key man representing the UK armed forces in Washington. That was where he would spend the rest of his life. And he died, I think, of a stroke or a heart attack. He died very suddenly in late 1944. And when he passed away, probably around about this time in 44, and when he passed away, George C. Marshall, who was the Chief of Staff of the United States Forces, was absolutely inconsolable. They had become such good friends. And he repeatedly wrote to Churchill and to various different leading figures within the British government, reporting. He said, I'm deeply grief-stricken by the loss of Dill, and he said, I don't think you guys quite understand what a terrible loss the death of this man constitutes to our alliance. And he was at his graveside. Dill is buried in Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, where you can see his grave to this day. And there's a kind of a statue or a plaque there to commemorate him, just at the edge of Arlington. And at his graveside, George C. Marshall was present alongside a whole load of American and British officers, and he was in sobs of tears during the funeral service. He was absolutely devastated by his death, and that's the kind of man I think Dill was in life. And I think
very important. Let's move on to 42. Oh, it's 41 again. Sorry. The number's gone corrupted again. It's Operation Crusader, and that's a map, if you can see it, what it meant. We're not military historians, but basically it's an attack. You got the Guards, the Indian Division, North Indians, New Zealanders, South Africans, all attacking towards to relieve Tobruk. Of course, the Tobruk was relieved and it broke out, but it was a temporary success, wasn't it, Joe?
Yeah, well, the Operation Crusader was a counter-offensive that the British had planned for quite a number of months, and they'd poured a lot of resources into it. So there are about 7 nations that take part on the Allied side in Operation Crusader. You got obviously the UK. You got Indian forces, you got forces from New Zealand, South African forces, Australian forces, and you also have forces from Poland and Czechoslovakia taking part in this battle. And obviously they're facing, Italy and Germany are in a coalition in North Africa. They're fighting together, and they're working very well as coalition partners, particularly under the command of Erwin Rommel. Now, the reason this is an offensive which starts off well. And actually, they're bringing overwhelming force to bear, but it ultimately crumbles halfway through because Rommel counterattacks and he basically throws the British back. And one of the key reasons why he succeeded was because Rommel was able to get high-grade tactical intelligence on the British movements. And the reason they were able to get this intelligence was because the Germans were able to intercept British RT or radio transmission communication, between tank units and between various different units that were basically on the move. And they were actually able to decipher if they were encrypted communications. They were able to basically decipher them. But the fact of the matter is the British had very poor RT discipline, and the Germans were able to work out where they were moving to, and basically they were able to interdict their movements about halfway through the operation, using inferior resources. And the Axis suffered very heavy losses. I mean, they suffered about 52,000 dead and wounded. The Germans lost nearly 15,000 troops in this. and the Italians lost about over 23, and they lost a huge amount of tanks and aircraft. But the Allied losses were considerably, the British losses were considerably less than the Axis losses, and they had deployed a force of about nearly 120,000 men against a force that was comparable in size, but they had superiority in terms of tanks and aircraft, but only very marginal. And they'd suffered considerably less casualties, but they lost a huge amount of tanks and aircraft, more than the Axis lost. So not in terms of human lives, but in terms of material losses. Crusader was a Pyrrhic victory for the British and Commonwealth forces. And there's a reason why Crusader is important, because the thing about it is it was designed to finally relieve Tobruk. The whole objective of it was a major offensive in Libya, where they would basically effectively encircle Tobruk, which was already been encircled by Axis forces, throw the Axis back, relieve Tobruk, and then move on towards Benghazi and take Benghazi and just basically give knockout blow after knockout blow after knockout blow, throwing the Panzer Corps Africa basically all the way back, as well as the Italian allies. But Rommel was just basically he was very lucky in that he was able to get supplies from the Italian merchant navy, were able to get supplies to Benghazi and Tripoli and to resupply them just in the nick of time. And he was able to use those resources, which he used very cleverly, in order to basically fight, to counterattack and to throw the British back. There was one last thing that I just wanted to say. This particular battle it's the first time that it's called Operation Crusader, and also there's a tank deployed by the British in this battle, which is known as the Crusader tank. Now, the Crusader tank didn't have very thick armor, very thin armor. It was very easy to knock it out. Its armament, we're talking about a 4-pounder gun armament. It wasn't particularly effective, particularly at long range. The reason why the Crusader tank was, in my view, an excellent tank was because it was bloody fast. It was faster than anything the Italians and Germans had, and it was able to outmaneuver and flip around and basically deliver, even with its tiny armament, it was able to deliver a knockout blow to the rear of a German Mark III. They were on Mark IIIs at this time in the desert, and it was able to knock them out. The way you take out a German tank, most tanks, you just basically whip around them and basically fire a shell in the back of the tank and blow up the engine. And that's what they were good at doing. They were also using Matilda tanks as well as Valentines, which were much slower. But in terms of the contribution to mobile warfare in the desert, I have to say that I would rate the British Crusader tank very highly. And I think this is kind of the introduction of, we're seeing for the first time the introduction of, sort of light, very fast, very effective tanks that are able to essentially very quickly flank an enemy force and basically inflict a tactical defeat. And the British nearly pull it off. They nearly pull it off in Crusader, but they just don't quite clinch it in the end, and it all basically blows back in their face.
Of course. Well, the sign of it, of course, is that in Tobruk was then besieged again. It fell in June 42, and Benghazi, which is one of the objectives of this campaign, was only taken in November 1942. It took a year. Anyway, let's move on to 42, because this is a massive battle, which is the Operation Uranus. I'm going to use the conventional term. And the front that it affected was more than 100 miles. Massive forces lined up against each other. And the German army in Stalingrad had managed to, well, they hadn't taken the town completely, and they were still fighting there. And the decision was made by the Soviets to outflank it, cut through north and south, and encircle it. And of course, Hitler refused to let the Sixth Army withdraw. And then this week in 1942, the Sixth Army was completely surrounded. So, Joe, I mean, in a couple of sentences, Stalingrad, is it right? It's the most important battle of the Second World War?
Keep the map up for the moment, if you wouldn't mind. So, Eddie, in my view, Stalingrad still occupies the place of being one of the most important battles of the Second World War, because literally the victory that the Soviets secure over the Nazi German forces, the Wehrmacht, is an historic victory, because it is the very first time where we will see the destruction of a whole German army. And this is a loss from which Germany will not recover. It will not ultimately recover from this defeat. It recovers from earlier defeats, the Battle of Moscow, and defeats that take place, temporary setbacks and whatnot. Stalingrad is a reversal which ultimately changes the course of the Second World War. You have the Battle of El Alamein taking place already, and then basically Rommel is knocked back, and you have the landings in North Africa. But this third reversal that takes place towards the end of 1942 is one that ultimately the Germans, it takes a while for the penny to drop, but this is really, as Churchill says, the end of the beginning. This is where finally the coalition between the United States, between the United Kingdom and the British Empire and Commonwealth, and the alliance, the very tenuous alliance with the Soviet Union, with all the moral conflict that brings. This is where it really comes of its own. Bear in mind that the Soviet front has been massively resupplied with huge amounts of resources that have been sent through Lend-Lease by the Americans. The British have been supplying the Soviets for nearly a year with their kit. 30% of the tanks that were used by the Soviets at the Battle of Moscow were British manufactured tanks. And then you now have the deployment of American resources. On the eve of battle, when the Soviets are about to launch their attack in Operation Uranus from both sides of the Stalingrad salient, and basically this pincer moving in to create what will later be known as the cauldron, a complete encirclement of Sixth Army. And that's the main objective: encircle Sixth Army and trap them within that pocket. The resources that they're using, they have US manufactured Willys Jeep. Zhukov himself is sitting in a Willys Jeep just before they're about to launch the pre-dawn bombardment and launch all the Katyusha rockets in order to break through in their respective areas. And the areas at the front where they break through is where the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies are stationed on either flank of the 6th Army. We're talking about poorly equipped, not poorly trained, but poorly equipped sort of Axis allies stationed at critical areas of critical flanks of the German front. And just to the north, you have an Italian army, about maybe between 200 and 300 kilometers to the north, holding their end of the front. And they at a later point are also going to be at the brunt of a massive Soviet offensive from another Soviet army. And ultimately, the encirclement is going to involve the deployment of well over a million Soviet troops. It's going to be an absolutely gigantic wave of men and steel. There's going to be air support as well. You're going to have Soviet Air Force resources that are going to be used to support ground operations. And we'll be dealing with the siege of Stalingrad as we move along week by week. But ultimately, the Germans are going to be left with a nightmarish logistical challenge, which they will not be able to solve, which is resupplying that 6th Army from the air once the encirclement is closed, which happens at that particular point. And you have, we have photographs of von Manstein
Well, he's made commander. He's made the most senior German commander in the Eastern Front.
Yes.
And Paul Ludwig Ewald is moved into our Army Group A. The guy on the right, I mean, he spends the rest of his life after all. He's convicted of war crimes and he dies in Moscow.
Yes.
Manstein didn't. So it shows you, how the fate of different people can be affected. Nobody remembers Ewald von Kleist, but people do remember Manstein. Why is Manstein an interesting figure in German military history?
Well, actually, when the two arms of the pincer snapshot, and I just want to say that a key, like Zhukov was like, I talked earlier about Zhukov coordinating the Leningrad front as well as basically commanding the defense of Moscow and the counterattack of Moscow. He's also in overall general command down around Stalingrad, when basically they launch Operation Uranus. But one of his key commanders involved in the Stalingrad offensive, who's a key field commander, is the man who I would argue is one of the best, if not the best, generals of the whole Second World War, of any nation in the entire war. And that is Rokossovsky, who's ethnically Polish. He was actually born in Poland in 1917, and he's a Soviet citizen, who basically rises to the ranks of the Red Army, and he nearly survives, basically been purged himself, but he survives it, and he proves himself to be a very effective field commander, and he's on the front lines with his own troops. Basically, he's wandering around inspecting them, whatever, and his men absolutely loved him. And he was definitely, I think, up there with one of the best generals of the whole war. And so we're talking about very, very considerable talent who are on the Soviet side, who are really coming of their own, who are prepared to use very brutal methods in order to get the job done. They will throw thousands of men and as much material as possible, like into this meat grinder, in order to get the job done. Where von Manstein is concerned, von Manstein is seen to be the savior. He's seen to be the solution to this particular problem. And what they do is basically the German, the OKW, OKH, basically the German High Command, they come up with a rescue plan, a rescue operation, basically an armored thrust into basically southeastern Russia, basically down towards where the Caucasus are and Rostov and Stalingrad, into the Don area, basically, the Don-Volga corridor, in order to break open the cauldron and basically break the siege of Stalingrad. And they reckon Manstein is put in charge of this, and he's because of his expertise with armored warfare, and it's meant to be in like an armored spear, basically, that would be thrust with as much force as possible in order to break open the siege. But it ultimately doesn't happen. They're bogged down with very, horrific winter conditions. Rats and mice basically get into the tanks when they pause for rest, and to refuel and whatnot, for an overnight pause. And these vermin run into the tanks and basically start eating the wiring because they're starving, and essentially the tanks stop working. And so they have to cobble together as much spare parts as possible to get the remaining tanks and basically reverse them back. And there's a very sad story of a German tank commander who basically he's turning his tank around when they decide to turn back. And he essentially he turns his tank around, and then he just turns around in his turret and faces in the direction of Stalingrad and salutes in the direction of Stalingrad, and then starts his tank and moves back, heads back west. So the whole effort is a failure. Manstein's career, actually, to be fair, he doesn't really feature very highly after that particular point. It's the last major operation, I think, where Manstein is actually put in overall, operational command, of a major armored effort within the Second World War, as far as I'm aware. Von Kleist also was a very great armored warfare commander, but obviously the two men faced different fates. at the end of the war. Von Kleist faded into sort of relative insignificance, but he was remembered by many of his contemporaries as an absolute, one of the great German geniuses of sort of armored, panzer warfare. Whereas von Manstein basically has a sort of a cult legendary status, which is perhaps a little bit overblown.
Yeah, okay, well, that's 43. We're talking now Pacific. So in November 43, the Gilbert Islands. So we have discussed the New Guinea campaign and the Solomon Islands campaign. So everybody recognizes New Guinea, I hope, the second largest island in the world, which is north of Australia. And then to the east of it, there's a great string of islands known as the Solomon Islands. And as we're telling this story, the fighting is continuing in New Guinea. Now, the Gilbert Islands were then chosen for a major marine operation. So the two islands is the Gilbert Islands, Makin and Tarawa. So these are the Gilberts. And basically, I think I'm right in saying that this was the first major deployment of the Marine Corps in a typical classic amphibious operation, for which they became subsequently famous at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Am I right on that?
Not exactly. I mean, okay, so this is the first time that so basically the first Marine Division were landed at Guadalcanal in an amphibious operation in the traditional sense, and they used landing craft and all of this kind of stuff. But that landing was not opposed. What you're referring to is basically the first time that the Marines are deployed in an opposed landing.
Right. Yeah, okay, Joe, I stand corrected.
Yeah, no, I see what you're trying to say, Eddie. That would be correct in the sense that you mean it. This is the first time where you're seeing the Marines. There's a reason why this battle is important, because the Marines are involved throughout the Pacific campaign in a lot of these kind of battles, and we don't always remember all of them. I mean, Peleliu was a battle that virtually nobody remembered, except for the fact that it was an infamous campaign, possibly pointless. But it was only in recent years that the Battle of Peleliu became seen as significant, and it was depicted in the Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks series, The Pacific. But you have basically Tarawa as the first example of this kind of, sort of island, of the bloody island hopping campaigns in which the U.S. Marine Corps become engaged. Tarawa is where the American public first wakes up to the actual cost of what's going on in the Pacific and the blood price that is being paid. I mean, the Marines. Okay, so you have two islands that are taken by the amphibious forces that basically are deployed, and this is the first kind of major landing operation in the Central Pacific area. They've been previous to this, they've been doing most of their fighting in the South Pacific. The Marines have been deployed there in support with army units as well. So it's the army and the Marines that are doing fighting on land in the South Pacific. But suddenly the Marines are basically pulled away from that, and the South Pacific becomes solely an army theater of operation. And the Marines are going to be now used in the Central Pacific to move across these tiny specks that basically nobody's ever heard of, these coral and sand atolls. And the reason Makin, and you can bring up that map again if you wouldn't mind, the reason why Makin, you can see it's in the central area of the Pacific there. The reason Makin and Tarawa are important is because of the fact that they hold very key strategic bases. Makin actually has a relatively good deep water sort of basin where you can basically base, you can put a lot of vessels within that lagoon. It's not very possible to do that in other parts of this island chain, but Makin is a good place to do it. It was used as a refueling station for submarines by the Japanese. Tarawa is further down. Tarawa, particularly the Betio Island of Tarawa, and this is a very long, thin island. Its significance is that it has a runway. It has an airbase on it. and its key importance. It's a key island in this whole operation because of the fact that it has an airbase. And given the massive expanse of ocean in this particular part of the Pacific, the key thing for U.S. strategy in the Pacific is to basically, it's a campaign basically more or less made up of seizing island bases that have airfields and also good, decent anchorages from where to base their ships. But airfields are particularly important. And this is like Guadalcanal was a campaign of this nature. The only reason Guadalcanal mattered was because the Japanese had put a runway on it, and the Allies saw the strategic importance of that airbase and decided to take it and use it against the Japanese. Tarawa is exactly the same. They're taking an airfield that the airbase that the Japanese have on Betio Island, and they're taking it away. What happens in the operation is you have, it's an absolutely bizarre situation. You have Holland Smith, who's the 5th Marine Corps commander, basically, and he's an overall charge of the entire operation. But he's one of 3 Smiths that are basically in charge in the Tarawa operation. It's absolutely crazy. But you have an army commander with the surname of Smith. His name is basically Major General Ralph Smith. And then you have the Marine Corps commander, Julian Smith, who's in command of the Tarawa operation. He's in command of the 2nd Marine Division, which is a veteran division that basically was used at Guadalcanal. They came in after the 1st Marines and basically reinforced the 1st Marines during the Battle of Guadalcanal. And the 2nd Marine Division are going to be used in the Tarawa operation. It's their division, while the 27th the U.S. Army's 27th Division are going to be used on Makin. Makin is going to be it's going to be a complete walkover. They are going to go onto that island, and basically they're going to take it in not even a day. They're going to take it in a matter of hours, and they absolutely mow down any opposition. Makin is, as an island, it's very difficult to defend. Betio, on the other hand, involves basically overcoming entrenched positions. The Japanese have fortified this island. They've created entrenchments. They've created dugout positions, artillery positions, machine gun pillboxes. They have it all, basically, and they've got bunkers dug into the island, particularly around the runway. They're using anti-aircraft defenses that they've positioned all around the runway that are basically dug into pits in the ground, and they're using them against the Marines have been fired on in some places by anti-aircraft guns, so heavy weapons as well. The Marines go ashore, but they primarily land at a sector which is known as Red Beach, and Red Beach runs essentially to the north and to the south of a pier that stretches out into the lagoon off Betio Island, and they come ashore at this particular location. And this is basically, we're talking about Saving Private Ryan beach scene type casualties, where the Marines are wading ashore and they're basically been mown down by Japanese mortar fire, machine gun fire. They've been absolutely pelted, and they've got virtually no cover. And they come ashore. They're bogged down on the beaches, and it takes them several hours before they start to move inland towards the runway. And bear in mind, this is a very thin island. It doesn't take much effort to basically cut across the island and basically separate the Japanese defenders, basically divide the garrison up and basically cut it apart piecemeal. But it takes them ultimately 3 days to win that battle, 3 days of fighting. And they lose well over 1,000 men fighting on Betio Island. And there's remarkable color footage of the battle on Tarawa, and it's very visceral, it's very brutal, and you see basically this moon-cratered landscape after a naval bombardment. But Tarawa, as a battle, is the battle that basically, this enduring memory that the American public and the public and allied nations around the world will have about the cost, the price that the U.S. Marine Corps are paying in the Pacific, this blood sacrifice, wading ashore under heavy fire and basically losing thousands of men in the course of taking these tiny little islands where, it effectively looks like a fight to the death. Tarawa is really the battle that sets the scene for this type of warfare and this type of campaign in the Pacific.
Absolutely, and what is we remember Iwo Jima and Okinawa for the same reasons. So last thing, I mean, 2 more slides. I want to say this. This is Beirut, November 1943. So the French government has been given by the British, basically, you can come back and restore your imperial rule in Lebanon. And, well, they did, but then the British decided it wasn't going to work. And the French were forced to recognize the president and the prime minister. So November 1943, what's interesting about it becomes Lebanon's Independence Day. What's interesting here, it's the first phase of the disintegration of the French Empire. This is the first element of the French Empire. But so within 20 years, they say the British Empire disappeared quick. The French Empire, which included India, China, French West Africa, North Africa, the French Empire, massive in 1939. Now, in 1943, this is the first element of the French Empire to actually split off and become independent, set the scene for what happened in the Middle East and elsewhere in the subsequent 20 years. I'm not going to go into it too much. I just quickly want to talk about this. This is 1944, and this is the last slide. Well, almost the last slide. And this is basically where Allied armies, or some of them were, we mentioned Gelsenkirchen, which is just over the border from the Netherlands. That was taken by the British this week in 1944. Metz, as you can see, south of Luxembourg, that was taken by the French army. So the French army's point, and also Strasbourg, very important, right on the Rhine. So this is where the Allied armies were, the Americans. I think they're in between the French, or I'm not sure. Anyway, so so at this point, this seems to be the end or beginning end of Germany, because in December we have the Great Battle of the Bulge, which spoils things a bit. Anyway, I'm going to move on to, no, that's it. Actually, that's the last slide. Any final thoughts, Joe, before we close?
No, I suppose it's. I think it's fair to say that basically in the last, we're referring to 44 and the last stages of the Northwestern campaign in Europe. You know, been mounted by the British and the Americans. They're preparing for a long winter. Sorry, excuse me. Excuse me. They're preparing for a long campaign, a long winter, where basically they might be dug in on static positions, and they're keen to take as much ground as possible in order to line themselves up, strategically for essentially crossing the Rhine and making good ground, in the coming year in 45. It's obviously a bitter disappointment that they haven't made further inroads into sort of invading Germany by the end of 44 and get the boys home. There was this whole ambition of getting the boys home for Christmas and bringing it all to an end by the end of 44. There was this genuine hope that that would actually occur, but they recognize that they're in for a winter campaign, and they're not anticipating that the Germans will at any point attempt a counterattack, particularly in the middle of winter. There's a general feeling that they're too much tied up in the east, and such would be a waste of resources. They don't really feel that the Germans have much given them, and they're already bogged down in like a horrific attritional fighting. And the Hürtgen Forest campaign starts up at around this particular time, or it's ongoing at this time, and we're yet to get to the point where an offensive will be prepared in the Ardennes region of southern Belgium. But at the moment, the Allies are basically making tentative moves onto German territory, and they're trying to take key strategic locations in order to prepare themselves for a further advance once everything starts up in 45. There's another thing as well, and this needs to be remembered. People are probably querying why the Western Allies didn't make further advances or maintain the momentum throughout the winter of 44 and keep things going. A very key reason for that, they're running out of resources. They're running out of supplies. They have burned through massive stockpiles of armaments, of equipment, of food, ammunition, medical supplies, everything you can think of. These were stockpiles that have been built up long before 1944, from late 42, 43 onwards, to prepare for the invasion of Northwest Europe. These stockpiles are virtually depleted, and they are being restocked, as quickly as possible to prepare them for advances into Nazi Germany in 45. They recognize it's going to happen in 45. It's not going to happen before then. And we need to get across the Rhine. And actually, the Allies don't really, even though they have a reasonable amount of expertise when it comes to river crossings, they know that they need to secure their ends of the banks of the Rhine, which involves taking very tough territory that's very, very aggressively defended by the Germans. The Germans are desperate not to let the Allies have key footholds on key nodal areas along the Rhine River, so they can mount these crossings. And we're coming up to the point, we're a few months away from the anniversary of the Yalta Conference. And at the Yalta Conference, you will have British and American commanders asking their Soviet opposite numbers, can you give us a bit of advice? We're planning on a big river crossing in the coming weeks. And we're about to in Germany, and they don't mention the river, but obviously it's the Rhine. And this is a big, wide river. And we know that you guys, the Red Army, have done quite a lot of these in terms of throwing the Germans back. So would you be able to give us a bit of technical advice in terms of how you would go about this? They've already prepared it. They're going to use landing craft. They're going to use, LCTs that they're going to ship overland. And also they're going to use, DUKW, duck craft, as well as Amtraks as well, that are being, up until that point have only really been used in the Pacific. You get them used for the first time in the European theatre of operations during the Rhine crossing, and they're brand new, state of the art. This is going to be a new kind of warfare. Long story short, in order to land this plane, at this particular stage in the war, the Allies are nowhere near ready for what is to come, what they need to get ready for. And also bear in mind, their men are also absolutely bloody knackered at this particular
Well, this is an interesting point, because I'm not going into it, but there was this Canadian conscription crisis. So Prime Minister Mackenzie King, in his 70s at this point, a rather eccentric figure, and he stood up in the House of Commons and said, because there was pressure in the Canada in the Second World War, only volunteers were served overseas. Many volunteered because they didn't. Many volunteered, but they were not deployed overseas, and their plan was to draft them. That was to change the laws to make Canadian volunteers serve as conscripts, and mainly to replace the terrible losses, obviously in Italy, and of course the Canadian Corps was going to come out of Italy and then shift to the Northwest Europe, and in Northwest Europe. And this was a manifestation of the problems. And in the end, I mean, the issue is a bit of a specialist subject, but basically what happened in the First World War and the Second World War, the disproportionate number of what you would call British English-speaking people volunteered for the armed forces. There wasn't such significant volunteering in the non-English-speaking communities. And so the idea of making people who introduced the draft to make people force them to serve in the armed forces was going to go down very badly in the French-speaking areas, who were disproportionately hadn't volunteered. And this was the point. Mackenzie King makes a speech and he said, if we introduce the draft in Canada, it's going to be one of the great crises in Canadian history. And in the end, they come up with a compromise in which 16,000 are actually drafted and sent, but it's nowhere near the numbers that are required. And it's an evidence of the exhaustion in Canada, which have been one of the most enthusiastic supporters amongst the Commonwealth countries for the Allied campaign. Anyway, Joan, the final word before we close?
Yeah, I just wanted to address a few comments in the comment bar. So we had James McNeil and
there's lots.
Yeah, on Skeptical Observer. So one of the things that Skeptical Observer wanted to point out was that basically, Germans lost sight of the real strategic objective. This is in southern Russia, which is the Baku oil fields and not Stalingrad. That's true. It was Hitler was the reason why they made such a big push on Stalingrad, why they got bogged down in Stalingrad. And actually, I didn't make the point The other reason why Stalingrad was significant was because it was the first time that the Soviet army and actually many armies in the Second World War actually decided to just basically fight tooth and nail in the city. You know, but you already had this resistance in the city under a Soviet general named Shoikov, not to be confused with Zhukov, but Vasily Choikov was the commander in Stalingrad. He was commanding the defenses, and his army, or what little was left of it, it was basically, by the end, it was an army of street fighters, and they fought tooth and nail, you know, with everything that they could get their hands on, captured German weapons, Soviet weapons, essentially fighting the Germans. And the Germans were trying to clear these streets and clear these buildings, and they were being resupplied over the river. And basically Stalingrad was a bogged down nightmare, and really the objective was the oil fields of the Caucasus. That was the whole point of moving into that region in the first place. But ultimately, Stalingrad proved to be a massive distraction because Hitler also, there was a key reason. Hitler wanted to actually he wanted to cross the Volga. There was a sort of a mythical initiative in this mission. You know, you had this, culturally speaking, you had Volga Germans at one point in that particular part of what was then the Soviet Union, what was previously the Russian Empire. There was a sort of there was an historic mission, a kind of a mythical mission, which was very close to the heart of many Germans, that even those that were present at Stalingrad, that they needed to go to that particular spot and fulfill this historic mission. That it was, you know, that the Germans had reached this far. You know, they'd reached the edges of the continent of Europe, and this is the crossing point. This is the boundary, the natural boundary between the continent of Europe and the continent of Asia. We have other.
Let me read them out because I don't want to take. So, Skeptical Observer, thank you for your comments. I'm very sorry not to put them up. You say very firmly, no, the US Marines were the first on Guadalcanal, and Marines landed a post on Bougainville on the 1st of November.
We did make the point that they were at Guadalcanal. We did say that, and we said that from the very beginning.
And Tarawa is important because it was a very tough opposition, and a number of off-landing mistakes were made. So I think you covered that one.
But as regards Bougainville, it was an opposed landing, but not on the scale of what happened at Tarawa. I mean, there were a few machine gun posts when they landed Bougainville. They wiped them out.
Skeptical Observer. We appreciate Skeptical Observer's comments. James Mendeel makes the point in the Pacific campaign. The airfields become key once it is clear that bomber ops from China are another starter. We can deal with that in a future program. I think that's it. Question made by the Skeptical Observer: Germans on their territory, isn't that more casualties occurred after entering Germany than before? Well, we're not getting to the casual data, but we'll check that in a future program. I think that's got to be it, Joe. I mean, we've been going for an hour and 27 minutes. I think we need to close down. So what I'm going to say now is thanks very much again for a brilliant episode, and thank you for your contribution. So much knowledge, so many insights, and I really appreciate it. And so that's it, Joe. Look, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Good evening.
And now I'm just going to close the program by saying thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it and found it interesting. We'll be back next week around this time with another episode of This Week in the Second World War, a unique approach to covering the history of the conflict. Hope you find it interesting. We are doing a conference next April in London, and I'll keep you posted about that. So until next time, from everybody here at This Week in the Second World War, it's goodbye, good luck, and may God bless you all.